I'm Andrea Paciello. I've had the privilege of working at Mass General for about the last 18 years. Most of us wear many hats, as it sounds like many of you do, but my sort of day job is Executive Director of Teaching and Education. So I've been in that role about 3 years now. Prior to that, spent about 8 years as Executive Director of Radiation Oncology, and prior to that, about 5 years in surgery as Administrative Director there. And started out my career at MGH as an Administrative Fellow, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And you'll see that I use the term resident and fellow sort of interchangeably throughout this presentation, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in a few minutes. I did my undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill and my master's in healthcare administration at Michigan. And I'm very involved in ACHE, served as the regent for Massachusetts for a 3-year term a couple of years ago, and currently serve as president of the ACHE of Massachusetts chapter. Just to kind of orient you to Mass General, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but we're located in Boston. We were founded over 200 years ago by 2 physicians who looked around the Boston area and realized that the wealthy, had relatively good health care, at least, for that period in time, but that the poor basically, were left to kind of suffer at home. And they saw that as a problem, and so they founded Mass General really to be, a solution and provide health care for the, the community. As well as, recognizing that Harvard Medical School, which was a relatively new, medical school at that time, there wasn't a place for physicians to have actual hands-on clinical training. And so Mass General was founded as the first teaching hospital of Harvard Medical School. And I would say those sort of 2 founding elements have really defined MGH and continue to be sort of at its core 200 years later, that we're very committed to patient care and serving the community, as well as are very committed to the teaching mission. We have about 1,000 beds and about 25,000, it's now about 26,000 employees. It's a very humble organization. People are always surprised when they spend any time at MGH, given its sort of history and its stature, that it, people are amazingly very humble. But we are proud of the fact that we are consistently in the top 3 hospitals in the country, according to U.S. News & World Report, and it's a major research driver as the largest recipient of NIH research funds. So I was asked to sort of share best practices, having been a preceptor now for 5 or 6 years. And I have to say, as I thought ahead of time about what I was going to say today, I actually found this to be a bit challenging. For 2 reasons, and it's not because I couldn't think about what makes our sort of residency experience special or unique or differentiates it, but part of it is because best practice implies some form of relativity, and not knowing a whole lot about your programs, but knowing that you all I'm sure are as equally committed to providing a great residency experience as we are at Mass General. That it's a little bit presumptuous of me to think that we're doing something that much greater or better than any of you. So I will share best practices, but with the caveat that I know that there's equally as much that I could learn from all of you as that I'm sharing with you today. The second reason this is a little bit challenging is because trying to sort of articulate what it is that kind of makes the MGH experience special is a little bit like, trying to say what makes chocolate cake delicious. It's kind of like, well, I don't know, it just is. That there's something in the air, or as the hospital that first used and sort of publicly demonstrated the use of anesthesia, we say something in the ether. That there's just something in the culture of MGH that's very difficult to sort of put your finger on and articulate, but that really makes it unique. And this is something that we hear from the residents every year when I kind of sit down with them at the end of the year and say, what were your key takeaways of this year? What do you think sort of resonated most with you? What do you think will translate and transfer with you as you kind of continue your career? I would say year after year, the consistent theme is, the culture of the organization, and that the culture is, in many cases, dramatically different from the culture they've seen in other organizations they've been in. And this sort of desire to want to kind of like bottle that culture up and be able to inculcate it, in the organizations to which they know that they'll be in the future, and recognizing that that's difficult to do, particularly in sort of an environment where you have that mixture of civilians and active personnel, and the fact that there is sort of a transient turnover on the military side that we don't see as much on the civilian side. I do think culture is a big piece of it, but I realize that saying that is not going to be of any help to any of you. So I really, try to dig a little bit deeper and come up with, basically 4 best practices that I would sort of categorize as either structural or conceptual or philosophical perspectives, and I'll share those 4 with you now. So the first is, we made a conscious decision when we were first approached about having a Baylor resident to integrate the resident within our long-standing administrative fellowship program. Our administrative fellowship program is a 2-year program. I mean, this is obviously 1 year. But aside from that, our fellowship has been in existence for 45 years. And so it is, has a lot of credibility in the institution, incredible sort of leadership support and support throughout the organization. Nobody would need to send a letter to somebody ahead of time to introduce the concept, because it's just so well understood within the organization. And so there is a lot of visibility, and we wanted to make sure that the resident would have that easy access and ready visibility. And we found that has worked very well. We also knew that we would be sort of relocating the resident out of sort of their military family and sort of their support network, and there isn't much of a military presence in the Northeast. So we wanted them to have some sort of sense of community or family, and so this sort of administrative fellowship community has been a way for us to be able to do that. And it's been great because the fellows can talk with each other about projects. The second-year administrative fellow serves as sort of a mentor for the Baylor resident, and the first-year administrative fellow. And we have a huge fellowship sort of alumni community of about 15 or more people that are still at MGH, and they sort of wrap around and embrace the current resident and fellow and sort of support them. So I recognize that not all of you have administrative fellowships, and that might not be the right solution, but to think about are there ways that you can embed the resident in some form of community. And I say that knowing that the military is sort of well known for being, we could probably learn something from all of you in terms of how you build community, and that you're sort of famous for that building of family and sense of brotherhood, et cetera. Our second best practice is that and it sounds like this is not unique, but we have a rotation-based structure, and it's a little bit different for this 1-year program, but there are essentially 6 rotations that are kind of key functional areas, each precepted by a senior vice president, and the lengths vary depending on sort of our area of sort of focus. But that's an opportunity for the resident to sort of be embedded in a certain function, to work closely with that team in a concentrated way. And we do this for a number of reasons. One is that we want to make sure that they receive a well-rounded exposure. It'd be very easy to get to month 10 or 11 and realize they haven't had any exposure to public affairs, for example. It's also amazing from 1 year to the next how trends or hot topics or issues can really sort of change the focus and the inertia of an organization. If it's a Joint Commission year or the middle of EPIC implementation, it would be very, very easy for the resident and the fellow to kind of get sucked in that direction, and to really end up spending a huge amount of their time in that area. And so this is our way of sort of being more deliberate about making sure that regardless of sort of what's the vagaries of the day, that we're providing a consistent experience from one year to the next. We also think it's an important way for residents and fellows to kind of identify their interests and their passions. People will often say, I really didn't think I had any interest in human resources, and now I realize how very important that is to healthcare leadership. And vice versa, that generally, students in early careers can have blind spots, and a lot of times I see it around sort of finance, quantitative skills. Students will say, I'm really not that comfortable with Excel, and then they usually somewhat not consciously will kind of self-select themselves away from those types of experiences and learning opportunities. And so this is our way of sort of pushing them outside of their comfort zone a little bit, kind of forcing them subtly to kind of in those areas where they may not otherwise choose to go. And in the process, we find that they may not love finance at the end, but at least they're not, they don't hate it, and they're not going to avoid it. And that actually, much of the time they'll realize that they're much more capable than they ever thought they were. And that's really our role, is to help them sort of feel like they're capable of almost anything, that really tap into that potential. It's also, the rotation structure is a way to kind of have them have to be sort of quick studies to get immersed in an area, really get to know the people and the issues very quickly, and kind of foster that adaptability that has been important in healthcare, all along, but I would say is increasingly even more so. And again, this is probably an area where we could learn a lot from all of you. I think the military is, exceptional at sort of the way they move people through opportunities and kind of build well-rounded leaders. And two of the biggest, I think, benefits to this structure is that the resident spends each rotation with a different senior VP and gets to, in the process, learn from their leadership style, their leadership approach. Fortunately, all the preceptors are really exceptional leaders, and so they take away something different from each one of those people. And it also is a way to engage our full leadership team. It's not like the resident is just working with somebody on a specific project. Our full executive team feels ownership over this program, not just me as the preceptor, and they really feel responsible to the resident and to their development. We just actually had our graduation on Tuesday, as we do every year at this time, and it's amazing when you look around the room at graduation at sort of the senior leadership presence, and actually the fellow and resident are allowed to invite anybody that they want, and sometimes it's amazing the amount of connections they've made over the course of the year and the people they choose to celebrate that accomplishment with. And I think it's really telling about the strength of that sort of rotational structure. So within each of the rotations, they have projects that will be based in a rotation, but then they also will have projects that will be sort of cross-cutting. So things like a Joint Commission survey or an EPIC implementation, as an example, aren't, might be things that they would work on, but that wouldn't be specific to a project. That sort of brings me to sort of the third best practice. I would say, we sort of have this fundamental belief. Yes?
Can I ask a question on that prior slide?
Sure.
On the rotation schedule you've got, and I was just looking at the sample rotation that was in the manual, and where you had, rotations by each week. You have them much kind of more macro buckets. I mean, a lot of these would be almost sub-rotations under each one of your categories. Are you trying to hit all of these that are here, or are you just maybe not, or maybe I'm missing how this was set up to begin with?
So we, we consider rotations to be more functional, sort of fundamental areas that would be cross-cutting across whatever clinical service or whatever, whether you're in ortho or emergency medicine or, surgery, that these skills apply. But within each of these rotations, they have more granular experiences. So most of that sort of week by week list, they get to all of that through these rotations. They're just organized in sort of concentrated
When
chunks.
you sit down with the resident and do their administrative residency plan, does it look more like that in terms of the upcoming 12 months, or more like this?
I'd say at the beginning of the year it looks more like this,
Okay.
and they may have their plan for the first sort of 1 or 2 rotations, and then as the year goes by and they get into the rotation, they get much more granularity around it. Yeah. So so our best practice number 3 is really around the projects. We really view the importance of having that hands-on sort of practice and experience to be much more important than just sort of observational experiences. We certainly have some observation and shadowing and attending meetings, but we really try and make sure that the resident has a role as they do that, and that we have them get engaged in many projects, many more than the 3 that get written up for Baylor. Probably many more than they can ever actually be expected to reasonably accomplish. And I think this sort of gets to your point. Part of it is trying to help them figure out how to manage their time and competing priorities. Because once you get out, in your career, that's a constant challenge. There's always more work to do than there is time to do it. So helping them sort of figure out how to do that early in their career, we think is important. We're also, we sort of have the philosophy, we're generally not sort of telling the resident or the fellow kind of how to do things, that that's part of what this experience is about, is giving them the opportunity to sort of practice and develop their own skills and their own sort of judgment and decision-making approaches, and to try things out and sort of reflect and iterate and learn that way. And I would say, it's not uncommon on the 3rd bullet there for someone to say, we have this like vexing problem. We seem to comes up over and over, and we have no idea how to solve it. Let's give it to the resident. Let's give it to the fellow. That those often tend to be the best projects, because it gives the resident and fellow kind of an opportunity to take a leadership role, and they really bring some amazing sort of fresh perspective and energy to solving some of those problems. And sort of our kind of last and final best practices, we first and foremost treat this as an educational experience. We want and expect them to contribute, but the service needs are really secondary. So your comment earlier, I don't know your name, but your comment around what use are they to me if I don't know, if they don't know how to do this, you probably would never hear anybody at MGH say that, because we really have the philosophy that we're trying to help sort of build and develop them, and so we really encourage residents or fellows to sort of pursue their interests and kind of take advantage of opportunities, and really be a sponge and soak up everything that they possibly can while they're there. If there's a grand rounds in palliative care, or a director of population health management, to go out and talk to those people and take advantage of those opportunities. That there's sort of very few other points in their career where they're going to have kind of a dedicated ability and time and sort of an allowance to be able to do that. We try and make sure that our kind of the projects and the rotations sort of build on each other, so that they're getting kind of progressively more independence and more taking on more of leadership roles. And believe it or not, we actually encourage residents and fellows to sort of decline projects if it doesn't align with their learning needs. And I put this on here at sort of the peril of your thinking that we're encouraging students to sort of shirk work, but actually it's really the opposite, where we're trying to enable them to sort of free up their capacity to focus on things that are really going to build and develop their leadership skills, knowing that time tends to be our #1 constraint, and so we want to enable people to kind of tap into their talents. And we also really try and encourage risk taking, and know that we all are learning throughout our careers, but this is especially true. The learning curve's a bit steeper when you're a student and an early careerist. And I tend to see that most of the things that where the residents and fellows struggle is more around sort of the politics, the interpersonal communications, sometimes the sense of sort of this headstrong kind of like jumping into the solutions without really kind of pausing to really understand fully the problem. I think somebody mentioned that earlier. So not major blunders, things that really just take some coaching. They're not things that we document or write up. They're things that we appreciate that are part of sort of the natural learning and development process. So the last thing I would say is thank you, and from two reasons. One is having in Boston, we had the Boston Marathon bombing. We just celebrated the 5th anniversary of that. Fortunately, there weren't a lot of casualties, but there were a lot of extremity injuries and amputations and sort of a week of terror. And I would say it was a real wake-up call to Boston and really, I think has still had an impact on the city, where people, myself included, really appreciated that we have the luxury of being able to take our safety somewhat for granted most of the time, and that's really because of all the work all of you who are in the military do to enable all of us to be able to sort of pursue kind of the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So thank you for your service to our country and for allowing us that freedom. The second thing is that we have many employees who are either in the military now or who have been previously. We also have the home base program where we're taking care of a population of patients who've been in the service. And so as much as we would like to think that we're leaving the Baylor resident with lessons learned and teaching them something, they equally teach us. And it's been a very bi-directional relationship. And so we know that this is sort of the talent that's coming from your organizations. And so we thank you for allowing us the opportunity to have them spend the year with us. And we really learn a lot from their experiences and sort of their rich life and professional perspective. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. Yes?
So I have a question for you. You stated that many of your VPs are either graduates of your resident program or have been involved with your current fellowship program. Right. How do you, when you get maybe somebody new into your organization, like many of us experience, how do you indoctrinate them into your organization's culture first and to accept the resident and want to really provide that necessary educational experience? Does that happen in your organization?
Yeah, and that's where I think we are a little bit different, that we don't have that same level of turnover. Most of our senior VPs have been in their roles for a decade or more. And so there's a real stability there in terms of leadership. And we would not take somebody who had just joined the organization within the last year or two and expect them to be sort of the preceptor for one of those rotations, because we think they would need to, we'd want to make sure that they're going to provide the right sort of philosophical approach. But again, we have the luxury of being able to do that, and we have the sort of depth of leadership talent where we can do that. I recognize that may not be something that you all can do if your leadership is turning over with much higher frequency. For 3 months, yeah. Well, you're here today, so that says something right there.
I was going to ask a question because having a residence is not new to me personally. I had residence when I was here in San Antonio before, not Army-Baylor residence. This is my first experience with the Army-Baylor program, but with the Baylor MBA program, Scott Garner, I've had his residence every year for a while, as well as training with industry, military Fort South. But kind of the question I've got with you, since you're with another civilian organization, what's been your observation as to, are there any consistent blind spots may not be the right word, that when a resident comes in, coming from a service background, coming from either military facilities or treatment facilities, wherever, that you're on the lookout for and become early part of that orientation?
Well, I have to say we've been surprised in two regards. So when we originally, thought about our rotations, we had made some assumptions about rotations that we figured wouldn't be relevant. So first we were thinking, well, why would they need an HR rotation? The military just basically assigns people where they need to go and they're going to do whatever they tell them. And we were, quickly sort of told, no, that's not the case. And that there's actually a lot, relevant to, in an HR experience. And the same with finance. Initially we were kind of like, well, they're not needing to deal with the revenue cycle in the same way. And we were quickly sort of course corrected that, there's they still need to manage, federal funds and budgeting, and that there's some, important aspects of sort of the financial experience that would be very important. So I would say it has not been as different as what we originally thought. The other thing is we were sort of a little bit worried, to be quite frank, that we would get people who sort of had this like regimented sort of like, here's how you're going to do it. Didn't really understand the sort of cultural environment that values everybody and their perspective and sort of listens. That it was going to be kind of like this top-down approach. And maybe it's because Baylor's done a great job of sending us the right type of person, but we have not had that problem, and we were sort of on the lookout for like the cultural mismatch. And we've been, very impressed with the residents that have received, that they really have blended in pretty seamlessly. And I guess one of the challenges we had, some of them have been clinicians. And depending on the type of clinician that they are, I'd say we've seen a little bit more of a challenge around having them take off their clinical hat and, really look at things from the leadership lens. That's probably been the bigger challenge, and that, I'd say we've had varying levels of success with. And it's tricky because we know when they go back after their year that they're going to have, they're always going to have that clinical hat with them, and that is part of their, responsibility within the military. So if anything, I would say that has been maybe the, trickier piece, is sort of navigating that dual role of being both, a clinician often as well as an administrator. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. Yeah.
And we should get them together.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So a big thing that I heard you discuss was culture, and the culture of your organization that's out there. So have you, haven't had the experience personally of leading health care organizations across the entirety of the United States. My experience is healthcare is local. What populations demand in the way that administration and politicians view healthcare is very much geographically oriented in the country.
Yeah.
And so have you had the experience of having residents come in that might have an opposing viewpoint on what healthcare is within society? Is it an entitlement? Is it a market traded good, et cetera? And would that impact, if you did, would that impact on how you would approach that individual during their residency?
We haven't had that experience, and it may be that I think Baylor has sent us the cream of the crop, so we haven't had that experience. I would say we are a not-for-profit academic organization, so our philosophy is more around that. We think everybody, healthcare is, probably more on the side of a right. But we haven't had like political, major political differences of opinion. And I guess I would say our environment is one in which we really try and encourage sort of respect and diversity of opinion, and that makes us a better organization when people have different perspectives, and that we're free to have a healthy debate around those types of topics, and if anything, we would, encourage it rather than discourage it. So I don't know if that helps at all. Yeah.